The applause rolled through the ballroom like a rehearsed cue, bouncing gently off marble columns and high gold-leafed ceilings. Crystal chandeliers trembled from the energy in the room, the clinking of champagne flutes punctuating every laugh, every smile pulled a bit too tightly. The Maddox Foundation Gala was as always immaculate. The women wore satin and sequins in shades of wealth navy, deep burgundy pearl. The men were tuxedoed carbon copies, their cufflinks catching light and legacy with every movement. And standing beneath the largest chandelier holding a lacquered program in my hand, I listened as the host cleared his throat and began reading the revised donor list aloud. As of this afternoon, he announced our lead platinum-level sponsor has graciously deferred her position. We would like to thank the interim primary benefactor, the Danforth Investment Collective, for stepping in at the 11th hour. A collective pause fell like dust across the room. It lasted only half a beat, but I felt it ripple beneath the surface. My name was gone. Not reduced, not misread, absent, deliberately. Estelle Maddox. My mother stood across the room with a wine glass poised inches from her lips. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her smile had been perfected through 4 decades of cocktail diplomacy. But her fingers tightened around the stem just slightly. Griffin Maddox, my father, was mid-conversation with a state senator, but his gaze slid to the stage the moment the words deferred her position were spoken. The senator kept talking. My father no longer heard a word. I felt no rush of victory, no flush of rebellion, just a strange, subtle alignment. Like something that had been quietly untrue for years had finally clicked into place. 12 hours earlier, I'd been standing just outside the powder blue drawing room of our family's home on Lakeshore Drive. The staff were setting up for a pre-gala brunch. White lilies, tall crystal vases, miniature name tags with embossed gold. I'd come to drop off a legal draft for review, a harmless excuse. I wasn't expected until the evening. Inside, I heard the usual cadence of parental choreography. My father giving last-minute directions in a voice that never rose, only sliced. My mother listing menu substitutions like national threats. Then the shift. My name. She'll be there tonight, Estelle said, and she'll wear what I've chosen. It photographs better against the curtain backdrop. She wore that forest green last year. It made her look severe. She is severe, my mother said flatly, but then softened. She's our daughter. She can behave, Griffin. My father exhaled through his nose. She's only useful if she behaves. And then more pointedly, don't let her speak. God help us if she improvises. I won't have her embarrassing us again. There it was. No one saw me freeze in the hallway. No one noticed me turn. No one heard the soft click of the front door as I left. I didn't shout. I didn't storm back in to defend myself. Instead, I drove to the Maddox Foundation's administrative office, entered through the side door, and asked to see the donor relations director. I smiled politely and said I needed to amend a filing. No one asked questions. No one dared. I signed the form, removed my name from the gala's donation registry, and left without taking the offered sparkling water. I had no speech prepared, no plan beyond that moment. But I knew I would no longer stand in a room and let them use my presence as a pawn while muting my voice. My name is Sierra Maddox, and I've been a compliance attorney for the past 11 years. My firm oversees some of the most complex corporate cases in Illinois, including internal audits for 3 Fortune 500s. But if you ask my parents, they'll tell you I'm a good fallback plan. A quiet Maddox who doesn't ruffle feathers. Who's convenient in boardrooms and absent from headlines. Not because I've failed, but because I've never played the part they scripted for me. Now, as the host moved on to thank the floral sponsor and a new tech partner, I glanced down at the program in my hand. On the last page, my name had been replaced with a generic placeholder, additional lead supporter, formerly confirmed. That's all I was to them now, formerly confirmed. My phone buzzed once in my clutch. I didn't look. I already knew the number. There would be more. Dozens more. Some from Chase, my brother, who had always danced the line between golden child and financial disaster. some from the family's legal advisor, and eventually, inevitably, from Griffin himself. But for now, I stood still among 200 guests in a room that smelled of old money and new politics, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was the one who should be ashamed. Something was cracking beneath the polished floors of the Maddox legacy. And I wasn't going to be the one to patch it. Not this time. I used to think image was everything. Not because I believed it, because in my family, it was the only thing that mattered. We weren't raised to be honest. We were raised to be appropriate. The Maddox name, as my father often reminded us, wasn't just a name, it was a brand, a legacy, a shield. And like any well-maintained brand, it required polishing, positioning, and sometimes a bit of rewriting. Growing up in our Georgian revival home just outside Lincoln Park, I learned early how to be palatable, not likable palatable. I was the quieter one, the one who read contracts instead of diaries, who learned the difference between slander and libel before she got her braces off. Chase, on the other hand, could light up a room by entering it late and unprepared. He had our father's jawline and our mother's flair. People called him magnetic. I called him untouchable. At 12, I was already the one who filled out the thank you cards after holiday galas. I was the one who reviewed press release drafts when Dad's assistant was out sick. I had opinions, but I learned to file them away, silent notes to self never to be spoken aloud. My mother used to say I had an intense way of looking at people, which was her delicate code for stop making people uncomfortable with your intelligence. They never really saw me unless they needed something fixed. And even then, only behind closed doors. I still remember the first time the family truly panicked. It was nearly 10 years ago. Chase had just launched a tech consultancy advising companies on digital transformation, despite barely being able to reset a router. He'd charmed a city council member into backing a grant, which would have been fine if he hadn't also accepted private funding from a health data company with a pending city contract. The potential conflict of interest exploded into a whisper campaign that nearly made it into the Tribune. My father called me at 11:42 p.m., 11:42, which was how I knew it was serious. He didn't ask how I was. He never did. "We need your help," he said. Chase may have overstepped. That was Griffin's way of saying he might have broken the law. I worked through the night, drafted a public statement coordinated with outside counsel, and quietly convinced the data firm to retract its press release, citing Chase as a strategic partner. By morning, the threat had evaporated. Chase went on to post a photo of himself at a charity golf tournament with the caption, "What a week. The crisis was over." And just like that, I returned to invisibility. At the next family dinner, my father toasted to resilience and clinked his glass against Chase's. Not a word to me, not a nod, not even a glance. That's when I understood the rules of the Maddox script. If you're loud and charming, you get the credit. If you're quiet and effective, you get the task. And if you're inconvenient, even once you get erased. It didn't matter that I graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern Law, or that I'd been promoted to lead compliance counsel at the largest private firm in the city by age 35. To them, those were footnotes. To my father, I was someone who keeps things from getting messy. A mop with a resume. A fallback. "You have a very useful mind, Sierra," he said once. "Just be careful not to make it your personality." That sentence has lived in the back of my ribs ever since. The deeper irony, of course, is that the very image they were protecting, the poised, infallible Maddox brand, was built on people like me, doing things they refused to acknowledge. My mother handled optics. My father negotiated power. Chase walked around like a living endorsement deal. And I kept the floors from caving in. Quietly, legally, invisibly. I used to think it would get better with time, that at some point they'd see me not just as a fixer, but as a force. But the older I got, the more I realized in their eyes, I was only valuable if I stayed just visible enough to lend credibility, and just quiet enough not to threaten it. Which is why I knew standing in that ballroom, listening to them choke down the consequences of losing me, that I had finally broken character. And for the first time, the script didn't own me. 1 week before the gala, a cream envelope arrived at my office, hand-delivered by a courier in a navy suit who smiled too much and said too little. I already knew what it was before I opened it. The embossed Maddox Foundation seal on the flap was impossible to miss swirling gold script and subtle intimidation. Inside was a neatly folded packet wardrobe suggestions, speech notes, and a personal letter from my mother on heavy stationery that smelled faintly of orange blossom. The wardrobe list had options highlighted in blue pencil floor-length jewel-toned, preferably navy or plum. No green, no velvet, and under no circumstances, that forest shade from the 2021 gala, as noted in parentheses. The speech was more of a monologue, 3 minutes pre-written, filled with familiar language about legacy responsibility and the weight of vision. I was to deliver it near the end of the program, just before the unveiling of a new wing of the Foundation's outreach division. I read through it all in silence, sitting at my desk, while emails stacked up in the corner of my screen, and the faint sounds of my assistant tapping on her keyboard floated in from outside. My office overlooked Michigan Avenue 22 floors above the chaos. Normally, it made me feel insulated. That day, it made me feel trapped. I could feel the setup, the delicate threading of a night that would run precisely on script as long as I did what I was told. And the message, though not typed anywhere, was loud and clear. Look the part, say the lines, don't improvise. It wasn't the first time they'd tried to manage me like a campaign risk. 3 years earlier, I had been invited reluctantly to speak on behalf of a young staffer who had reported misconduct within one of our family's affiliated donor organizations. She'd been a college intern, barely 20, and terrified. I knew the risks of getting involved, but I also knew she was telling the truth. I reviewed the documents, followed the money trail, and confirmed the conflict. The man she reported an executive board member was quietly reassigned without public notice. But when a reporter contacted me for a statement, I confirmed that the foundation takes integrity seriously, regardless of reputation. That single sentence landed me in my parents' kitchen the next morning, still in my coat, being told I had nearly torched years of carefully maintained relationships. My mother looked like she'd swallowed vinegar. My father didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He said I was thinking like an idealist, not a Maddox. Chase, of course, was nowhere to be found. He rarely showed up for the hard conversations. Since then, everything I said or didn't say was pre-approved. My inclusion in family events became conditional. Invitations were never extended directly, but routed through assistants. Appearances became choreographed, and any deviation, no matter how small, was treated as sabotage. I was a potential PR crisis in heels. So when I received that pre-written speech and that curated outfit list, I didn't feel included, I felt contained. Later that evening, I stopped by the family estate for what was supposed to be a planning dinner. The house looked the same as always, spotless, towering, overly formal, like no one truly lived there. Estelle met me at the door in a taupe cashmere cardigan, her pearls perfectly aligned, a glass of white wine already in her hand. She kissed my cheek lightly and led me toward the dining room. Chase was there, laughing too loudly at something on his phone. My father arrived late as usual, carrying 2 phones and no apology. We ate seared salmon over lentils while they talked about seating charts and guest visibility. It was all going smoothly until I asked calmly, "Why am I giving the closing speech instead of one of the co-chairs?" There was a beat of silence. Then my father, without looking up from his plate, said, "Because people believe you when you speak. You make the whole thing look credible." That would have sounded like a compliment if it hadn't been said so strategically. After dinner, Estelle followed me to the foyer while I put on my coat. She adjusted my scarf with her usual gentle touch, but her voice was carefully calibrated. "This night is too big to ruin," she said, smoothing the edge of my collar. "Please don't go rogue." There it was, no threat, no demand, just a perfectly polished warning. I nodded once and stepped out into the cold night, but something in her tone stuck with me. It wasn't just anxiety over another gala. It was fear. Not of me, but of what might come out if I spoke without a script. That's when I knew something more was tied to this night. Something about that new expansion wing, about the funding, about the sudden insistence that I be front and center for once in full view. Not because I was being honored, but because I was being used. And I intended to find out exactly how. The file landed on my desk with the weight of something that wasn't supposed to exist. My paralegal Devin had flagged it by accident. He thought it might have been tied to one of our clients' filings. It had been emailed to my work address tucked inside a batch of disclosures forwarded by an institutional bank we'd worked with on a compliance audit. Maddox Foundation wasn't even the primary subject, just a footnote, a formality, a name on a line, except the name was mine. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. A misplaced template, someone at the foundation reusing an old document. But the date on the signature block was from 5 months ago. And the line that stopped my heart was halfway down the third page, personal guarantee secured by Sierra Maddox, acting in individual capacity to support credit issuance for capital development. Not on behalf of, not reviewed by, just me. I read it again. Then I checked the attached documents. The $3.2 million credit line was real. It was tied directly to the foundation's expansion wing, the one being unveiled at the gala. The paperwork was clean, legally airtight, except for the part where I hadn't signed it. I stared at the screen, my palms going cold. There was no signature page included, which wasn't uncommon in internal reference copies. But everything else pointed to the fact that someone had used my name to secure financing, and no one had thought I deserved to know. I didn't confront my father. I didn't start there. I started with Estelle. I drove to the estate the following morning, no warning, no text. The security gate opened without hesitation. My license plate was still in the system. Inside the house was silent but awake. Estelle was in the sunroom rearranging a stack of coffee table books in color order, as if Vogue photography could hold back the flood of actual chaos. She looked up with mild surprise when I walked in, but her smile returned quickly as though I were a pleasant brunch guest instead of her daughter with steam building behind her ribs. "Sierra," she said, rising. "You're early. The seating committee, I need to ask you something," I interrupted. My voice wasn't sharp, just level. Controlled. I handed her a printed copy of the guarantee. "Did you know about this?" Her eyes flicked down. She scanned the first few lines, then paused just long enough to confirm she recognized it. "Yes," she said softly. "Of course. It's part of the funding structure for the new wing. And my name is on it. Yes." I waited, but nothing else came. No apology, no explanation. Just a calm acknowledgement as if I'd pointed out an error in a recipe. "I never signed this," I said. I was never told about it. Estelle took a small breath, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on the edge of the paper. "It was easier this way," she said finally. "Your name carries weight, Sierra. The bank needed someone with established personal credit, someone who looked stable, responsible. Someone with credentials beyond Chase's pitch deck and your father's charm." I blinked. "So you thought borrowing my name was a smart shortcut?" "It's not borrowing," she replied, still composed. "You're a part of this family. We assumed you'd support the initiative. You've always believed in giving back." I stepped back like I'd been slapped. There's a difference between giving back and being used. She tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering. "You're overreacting. No one forged anything. The foundation submitted a proxy notice. You were listed as a non-executing guarantor. It's symbolic." "No, Mom," I said. "It's legal. My name is literally guaranteeing a line of credit, and if something fails, if the foundation defaults, I'm exposed." "Personally." Estelle folded the paper with slow precision, aligning the corners, like it would make this conversation easier to swallow. "Sierra," she said gently, "you've always been the reliable one. That's not a flaw, that's your gift. You ground the rest of us." I let out a short laugh, dry, bitter. "You mean I make it look like you know what you're doing?" She didn't answer. I turned to leave, but paused at the archway. "You didn't even ask me," I said quietly. "You didn't think I deserved a choice." Estelle's voice came softly behind me. "You would have said no." "Exactly." I walked out of the house and into the cold, the wind from the lake biting at my coat sleeves. In that moment, the truth crystallized. They didn't trust me. They didn't value me. They relied on me, but only when it served their agenda. My career, my reputation, my stability, they had become tools, commodities, useful not for who I was, but for how well I could prop up their illusion. And they had done it without blinking. That's when I knew this wasn't a family legacy. It was a carefully constructed brand. And I was nothing more than the fine print. The first time I met Noah Ellison, he was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt, holding a leather-bound notebook instead of a phone, and asking sharper questions than anyone in the room had answers for. It was during a compliance panel downtown, 3 lawyers, a retired auditor, and 1 investigative journalist who looked like he'd wandered in from a different world. I was on the panel speaking about disclosure gaps in nonprofit funding. He sat in the audience eyes, narrowed but calm, jotting notes by hand. After the session ended, he waited until the crowd thinned out before approaching. No recorder, no camera, just, "I liked what you said about silence being a form of complicity. Can I ask you something off the record? Most men who approached me at events started with compliments masked as questions or worse, assumed I wanted to be saved from my own competence. Noah didn't. He asked about donor transparency clauses and whether I thought legacy foundations were structured to avoid scrutiny. When I gave a careful answer, he didn't push. He nodded, thanked me, and disappeared before I could even ask his outlet. I found out later that he freelanced for several investigative platforms, places that actually still cared about the line between information and spin. 3 weeks later, he emailed me not to follow up on a story, but to ask if I'd like to get coffee. No agenda, he wrote, just curiosity. And that's how it began. Now, almost a year later, he knew how I took my coffee without asking. He knew that I rewrote emails 3 times before sending them, and that I carried a separate notebook in my bag just for names I didn't trust. He never asked about my parents unless I brought them up. Never used the Maddox name like currency. And he never once looked surprised when I showed him the parts of myself I kept airbrushed out in public, the cynicism, the burnout, the tired kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded but unseen. That night, after confronting Estelle, I found myself parked outside his apartment in Logan Square without planning to be there. I didn't text. I just climbed the stairs and knocked once. He opened the door in bare feet and a soft gray t-shirt, holding a ceramic mug with steam rising gently. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just stepped aside and said, "I'll make another cup." I sat at the end of his couch, curling my hands together, trying to find a place to start. After a few minutes, I pulled the folded printout of the guarantee from my coat pocket and passed it to him. He read silently, his face unreadable. When he finished, he exhaled and handed it back. "I had a feeling," he said. "The funding trail didn't add up last month. Their numbers were inflated on the quarterly release. I thought it was sloppy accounting. I didn't think they'd drag you into it." I looked at him not with surprise, but something else, relief. "You knew and didn't say anything." He shrugged. "It's not my job to investigate your family." And it didn't feel like something you didn't already suspect. He was right. I had suspected. But suspicion isn't the same as proof, and proof, when it finally comes, doesn't shout. It whispers. It folds neatly into your life like a document slipped across a desk. Noah sat across from me on the floor, his back against the edge of the couch, legs crossed. "You don't have to carry this for them," he said quietly. "You don't need to co-sign their legacy." I smiled faintly. It's not just the name. It's how easily they use it, how naturally I'm expected to say yes, like silence is my role. He nodded, because it has always worked for them. A long pause passed. Outside, the L rumbled faintly in the distance. Noah reached up to rest a hand on my knee, not romantic, not performative, just there, anchoring. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I stared down at the paper again. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I'm done pretending I don't see it." Noah didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. That's what made him different. He wasn't waiting to offer a solution or rescue me or spin this into something poetic. He just made space for me to think clearly. And in that quiet apartment surrounded by books and unmatched coffee mugs, I remembered what it felt like to be known without being curated, seen not through the lens of what I could uphold, but simply for who I was, no branding required. The thing about anger is that in my family, it was only ever allowed to wear one face, my father's. His sharp-edged disapproval could clear a room. My mother's discontent came dressed in silk, delivered with a tilt of the head and a smile that never touched her eyes. But mine had to be silent, swallowed, polished over. From the time I was 8, I learned to carry my rage in quiet forms, in color-coded folders, in straight-back posture, in meticulously chosen silences during dinner conversations where I was expected to nod on cue. If I'd ever raised my voice, they would have called it hysterical. If I'd cried, dramatic. If I had spoken too plainly, ungrateful. So instead, I became excellent at swallowing it whole, even when they used me. Especially when they used me. They never apologized when they needed something, never even asked, just assumed I would understand, that I would say yes, that I would always protect the name, because after all, it was my name too. But names I've learned don't mean the same thing to everyone. For them, Maddox was currency. For me, it became weight. The day before the gala, I put on a charcoal wool coat and a pair of black boots, and walked into Lakeside Federal Bank without an appointment. The reception area was bright with winter sunlight walls lined with framed photos of board members and partner organizations. One of them was the foundation. Of course it was. The woman at the front desk smiled with the kind of efficient warmth reserved for longtime clients and people wearing tailored wool. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like to speak to someone in commercial accounts. It's regarding a personal guarantee I'd like to revoke." She blinked, nodded, and gestured to a small seating area. "One moment. I'll get someone from the team." I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. I didn't feel triumphant or nervous, just steady, like I was finally doing something I should have done years ago. When the associate returned, mid-30s, pressed suit-kind eyes, he introduced himself as Thomas and led me into a quiet meeting room with a view of the street. We reviewed the file. He confirmed my identity. I signed 3 forms, 1 revocation, 1 notice of release, and 1 acknowledgement that I understood the financial consequences. "Do you want us to send confirmation to the foundation?" he asked. I paused for just a second. "No," I said. "They'll find out soon enough." He nodded. No questions. Just filed the papers and offered me a glass of water. I declined. There was nothing left to rinse down. Outside, the wind had picked up blowing dry leaves across the steps as I walked back toward my car. My heels clicked against the pavement, each step a punctuation mark I hadn't been allowed to use for most of my life. There was no grand confrontation, no speech, just signatures and silence. But in that quiet act, I reclaimed something they had taken for granted, the right to choose what my name stood for. The gala would go on, the guests would arrive, the champagne would flow. But the foundation's new wing, so carefully orchestrated, so publicly, tied to my face, would no longer have my name holding it up behind the scenes. And when the host announced the change and Griffin turned pale and Estelle tightened her grip on her wine glass, I wouldn't be there to soften the blow. That was the whole point. They had used my credibility like a piece of fine china dusted off when guests arrive, then shelve it until next time. But I wasn't a prop. I wasn't part of the furniture. I'd spent 3 decades making sure I never made things harder for them. And now I no longer cared if things got hard. Maybe they needed to. That night, I returned home to a quiet apartment, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. I didn't tell Noah right away. I didn't need a reaction. This wasn't a gesture. It was a decision. Some people fight with fire, others with words. I had learned to fight with boundaries, to draw them where no one had thought to look. And this one would hurt. They'll find out soon enough. The Maddox Foundation, Winter Gala, always began the same way: string quartet playing something French ballet attendants with military posture, and the faint scent of white roses laced with whatever perfume Estelle had chosen that season. It wasn't just a fundraiser, it was a stage. Every corner of the historic ballroom downtown gleamed under gold lighting, and every guest arrived knowing they were supposed to play a part. This year, the stakes were higher. The unveiling of the Foundation's new education initiative. The Maddox Reach was billed as the family's most ambitious legacy move, yet a supposed gift to the city's underserved communities, wrapped in tailored speeches and seven-figure donations. It was also the night they planned to tie my name to it for good. Until I untied it. Noah and I arrived just before 8. He wore a charcoal suit, not tailored, not flashy, just clean and pressed. He'd refused to rent something bespoke, and instead borrowed a jacket from his older brother who worked in insurance. When I told him he looked good, he'd smiled and said I'd rather be comfortable than ornamental. I wore a simple navy gown, understated enough to disappear if I wanted, but sharp enough to make a statement without opening my mouth. As we stepped through the grand entrance, I felt the energy shift. My mother saw us before we even crossed the threshold. Estelle approached like a diplomat. Her arms outstretched, her smile lacquered in grace. She kissed my cheek, then turned to Noah and offered a handshake that was firm, cool, and 2 seconds too short. Her eyes took in his shoes, the slightly off-brand watch on his wrist, the visible lack of deference in his posture. "You're Noah," she said with a nod that wasn't quite a question. "Glad you could join us." "Thanks for having me," he said, polite, measured. Her lips pressed into something that resembled a smile. "We appreciate your support tonight. It's an important evening for the whole family." When we moved toward the reception area, my father was speaking with a senator from Michigan. He caught sight of me and gave a tight nod, then returned to his conversation without a word. I'd been expecting that. Griffin Maddox didn't do confrontation in public. He did silence, controlled distance. But the way his jaw tightened when the senator mentioned something about the strength of the Maddox brand that told me everything I needed to know. Inside the room buzzed with donors, business partners, and a few carefully curated nonprofit directors. Everyone wore their best version of benevolence. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. I recognized a few faces from last year's gala, same suits, different pocket squares. Near the stage, Chase was holding court with 2 executives from an education tech startup, spinning something that made them laugh too loudly. He caught my eye for a second, then looked away, a faint flicker of discomfort passing over his features. The program began just after 8:30. Lights dimmed. The host, a polished man named Carter, who had been with the foundation for over a decade, stepped onto the stage with the practiced energy of a seasoned anchor. He opened with the usual platitudes: gratitude, mission, shared vision. A slideshow rolled behind him, photos of site visits and ribbon cuttings, children in classrooms wearing the foundation's navy blue polos. Then came the moment. "We're especially excited," Carter said, to recognize the remarkable support behind our newest initiative, the Maddox Reach. This program represents not only the future of equitable education, but the enduring values of the Maddox family. My mother shifted slightly in her seat. My father folded his arms. As many of you know, this wing has been championed by a number of generous benefactors, but one in particular, someone whose integrity and dedication helped bring this project to life. However, Carter's voice softened, carefully neutral due to recent administrative adjustments. Our lead sponsor has graciously stepped back from the naming commitment. We thank the interim lead sponsor pending reapproval. The words hung in the air like broken glass. I heard it before I saw it, my father's breath catching, a half-second of stillness. Estelle's hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. From across the table, Chase's expression shifted, the color rising in his face as he leaned slightly forward in his chair. Whispers began to move through the room, quiet but insistent, as guests turned to one another with puzzled expressions. Noah sat still beside me, his hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, not gripping, just grounding. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. I kept my eyes on the stage. Carter moved on seamlessly, professionally, but the damage had already been done. In a room built on image, the absence of mine had become deafening. They didn't know it yet, but something had cracked. And not the kind you polish over with another photo op. Not this time. I didn't speak a word through the rest of the program. I didn't need to. The sentence had done it for me. We thanked the interim lead sponsor, pending reapproval. By the time Noah and I got home, it was well past midnight. The city was hushed under a thin veil of frost streetlights, flickering gold against patches of quiet sidewalk. We didn't speak much during the ride. He kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting gently on my leg, steady and warm. There was no music, no analysis. Just silence, thick with understanding. Inside the apartment, I peeled off my heels and Coates stepped into the kitchen and opened a bottle of red wine I'd been saving for no special reason. Noah took 2 glasses from the cabinet without asking and followed me onto the small balcony. We sat side by side, wrapped in wool blankets overlooking the lake as it glimmered darkly under the winter sky. Somewhere in the distance, a boat's horn echoed faintly. Closer, only the hum of distant traffic and the slow drip of melting ice. I didn't check my phone. Not right away. Instead, I watched the water and sipped my wine while Noah held my hand beneath the blanket, his thumb moving gently across the top of mine. I didn't know what I was waiting for, just that I wasn't in a rush to be told what I already knew. Eventually, when the sky shifted from indigo to a softer steel gray, I picked up my phone from where I'd left it on the counter. The screen lit up in a dizzying, suffocating flood of red dots. Missed calls, voicemails, messages. I opened the call log, 43, Griffin, twice, then Chase, then again, my father's secretary, board liaison, Foundation's legal counsel, a no-caller ID number I recognized as the banking advisor's office. Estelle hadn't called. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than any voicemail could. I opened the first text. It was from Chase, timestamp 10:47 p.m., less than an hour after Carter had made the announcement on stage. "You don't know what you've just done." There were no follow-ups. Just that one line. I read it twice, then set the phone down on the coffee table. Noah poured more wine into my glass. "Want me to block their numbers?" he asked softly. I shook my head. No point. Let them scream into the void for a while. He nodded, said nothing more, and leaned back against the railing. His presence was quiet but grounding, like an anchor dropped into deep water. No analysis, no validation seeking, just space, just breath. The calls would continue. The messages would escalate. At some point, there'd be damage control lawyers, maybe even a headline if the board wanted to shift blame publicly. But in that moment, none of it touched me. Not really. Because what I felt wasn't satisfaction or revenge. It was clarity. For so long, I had told myself that walking away had to be dramatic, theatrical, that I'd only really broken free if there was a confrontation, a speech, a slammed door. But now I knew better. Sometimes freedom comes in the form of a void of being no longer available, of choosing not to respond, of sitting on your own balcony while the empire you refuse to keep holding up finally starts to tilt under its own weight. I looked out at the lake and let the cold air sting my face. I thought of how many nights I'd stayed up reviewing contracts for them, smoothing over statements, catching errors before they exploded. I thought of the years I spent being their safety net, while being told to stay quiet, stay pretty, stay useful. And I thought of the strange stillness I felt now as their calls poured in and I didn't answer. Noah leaned closer, his voice low. "You okay?" I took another sip of wine and let it sit on my tongue before swallowing. "I think I am," I said. Maybe for the first time in a long time. He nodded. "Good. You don't owe them a damn thing." We sat there until the sun began to rise, a thin line of gold stretching across the lake. I knew that morning would bring a new wave of fallout of strategic apologies and corporate spin. I knew they'd try to make me look unreasonable, disloyal, even unstable. But I also knew this: I was done being responsible for their image. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I wasn't hoping they'd finally see me. I had seen myself, and I had chosen peace. The paperwork arrived in a plain manila envelope, no return address, postmarked from a downtown office suite I didn't recognize. Noah had requested a copy of the original loan package directly from the financial institution, not as a journalist, but as a concerned third party reviewing the use of a name that didn't belong to the signatures attached. It had taken 2 days and a few polite but pointed phone calls to get a full set of documents. The envelope was his way of not making it feel official until I was ready. But I was ready. We sat at my dining table, coffee growing cold between us as I flipped through the packet. Page after page of neat lines and notarized pages. Financial language I knew by heart. Then finally the signature page. There it was. Sierra L. Maddox, written in smooth ink, crisp measured strokes. Only it wasn't mine. The S curled the wrong way, too broad at the top. The tail of the X slanted left, not right. And the loop in the D of my middle initial was absent entirely. Details no one else would notice. Details I'd know anywhere, because I'd spent a lifetime signing my name precisely the same way on contracts, affidavits, deposition summaries. My signature wasn't just muscle memory. It was the one piece of me that never changed even when I did. Noah didn't say a word as I stared down at the page. He didn't have to. When I finally looked up, I felt the heat rising from my neck, not as anger, but as betrayal. Slow, dense, undeniable. They forged it, I said flatly. He nodded. I thought so. I never signed anything, not even a proxy. No verbal confirmation, nothing. I know. I sat back in the chair, arms crossed tight over my chest. This isn't just shady bookkeeping. This is fraud. It is, he said carefully, and they knew you wouldn't catch it in time. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Just looked down at the signature again, stunned not by the act, but by the audacity. By late afternoon, I was back at the estate. I didn't text ahead or knock. I let myself in through the side entrance the way I used to after high school before late-night study sessions and early debate meets. The hallways still smelled faintly of cedar and floor polish, familiar and infuriating all at once. I found Estelle in the sitting room, leafing through fabric swatches, likely for some future event that would never make up for this one. She looked up startled, but not surprised. "Sierra," she said, smoothing her blouse. I didn't expect I tossed the folder onto the coffee table in front of her. It landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo louder than a shout. "You signed my name," I said. She blinked once, slowly, then glanced down at the folder without opening it. She started, then stopped. A breath, then another. "I thought you wouldn't mind. You thought I wouldn't mind you forging my signature on a $3.2 million credit line." It wasn't her voice caught. It wasn't meant to be malicious. It was just your name. A formality. A legal formality, I snapped. Tied to real money, real exposure, real consequences. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, but I didn't move. I didn't offer comfort. She'd spent her life mastering the art of crying just enough to deflect responsibility. "I didn't know how to ask you," she said finally. "Your father thought you'd refuse. And we needed someone with standing, with credibility, because Chase can't stay solvent for 5 minutes and Dad's last 2 filings are under review. I asked the bitterness cutting clean. So you came to me, except you didn't." Just then, Griffin appeared in the doorway. He must have heard the last line. He stepped in slowly, jacket off sleeves, rolled to the elbows, his version of relaxed, but his eyes were hard. "I did what I had to," he said. "We needed to secure the deal. You're part of this family, Sierra, whether you like it or not." I turned toward him, every muscle in my body screaming to lash out to drag this moment into the war it deserved. But something held me back. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way he said family like it was a contract I'd signed without knowing. Or maybe it was because in that moment I finally saw them clearly. Not as parents, not even as villains, but as people so addicted to image they'd sacrifice their daughter's trust for a signature. I picked up the folder, slowly slid the papers back inside, and straightened the edges. My mother watched me with wet eyes. My father didn't flinch. Without a word, I turned and walked out. Not a slam, not a scream, just silence, because some exits don't need noise to leave a mark. And I was done giving them more than they deserved. The story broke 2 days later. It wasn't front page scandal, not yet, but it was enough. Just below the fold on the city's most read daily, Maddox Foundation faces financial scrutiny after lead donor withdrawal. The subheading was sharper: Anonymous sources cite internal irregularities, family rift. Noah had warned me. It's coming, he'd said that morning, his laptop open beside his coffee. A friend at the Chronicle said they're printing it in tomorrow's edition. Griffin gave them a no comment. By the time the article hit the newsstands, the online version was already trending locally. My inbox lit up. I didn't respond. By late afternoon, the first real political consequence landed. One of Griffin's most prominent campaign donors, a tech venture partner with a squeaky clean public image and ambitions for a Senate endorsement, announced he was reevaluating all formal associations with the Maddox campaign in light of unfolding developments. Translation: you're toxic now. The foundation scrambled to contain it. They issued a carefully worded statement full of air respecting privacy, ongoing internal assessments, core values unchanged. But the damage was already blooming like ink in water. By day 3, the bank froze the Maddox Foundation's expansion account, citing clarity pending regarding guarantor authorization. I didn't need Noah to explain what that meant. I'd revoked my signature. The bank couldn't take the risk. The $3.2 million credit line was now an exposed wire, and without new collateral or a legitimate backer, the project was stalled indefinitely. I didn't celebrate. It wasn't satisfying, not in the way movies suggest it should be. Watching them scramble didn't undo the years of being minimized, the silence I'd been trained to maintain. But it did bring a strange peace. Like the truth had finally caught up to them. And I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Then came the call from the foundation's board chair. A woman named Dr. Marla Penridge, respected, measured, the kind of person who rarely made direct contact unless absolutely necessary. Ms. Maddox, she began, voice steady. We'd like to invite you to the next board meeting to clarify recent events. Your perspective would be valuable in understanding the full picture. I stood in my kitchen, the phone on speaker, as I rinsed a plate from last night's dinner. Noah was at the counter reading a draft op-ed on something unrelated. I let the water run before I spoke. Let me be clear, I said. I won't be attending. A pause. You were at least in part involved in the original agreement. No, I cut in calm but firm. I was used. My name was signed without consent. That's not involvement, that's fraud. More silence. I could hear the soft click of a pen on the other end. Even so, your input would help. I dried my hands, slowly, then leaned over the sink, letting the words settle between us before finishing. You used my name. You don't get my silence, too. I hung up before she could respond. Noah didn't say anything, just handed me my mug of tea. Later that night, I saw Estelle on a cable news segment, her voice smooth as silk, carefully redirecting the questions toward a misunderstanding in protocol. She didn't mention me. Not once, not even a veiled illusion. But Griffin wasn't on screen. He hadn't been seen publicly since the gala. A few reporters tried to corner him outside a closed-door fundraiser, but he ducked into a waiting car without answering a single question. Chase, true to form, had posted a carefully curated Instagram story, muted tones, faux inspirational quote, overlaying a shot of him looking off into the distance. Growth sometimes requires walking alone. I almost laughed. Almost. I knew what they were doing, spinning, deflecting, resetting the narrative. And maybe it would work on some. Maybe the Maddox brand would weather this like they had other storms. But this time I wasn't patching the sails. This time I had cut the rope. I went to bed that night with my phone on silent. There were still texts rolling in, people wanting comment, others offering sympathy I hadn't asked for. I ignored them all. Because this time, I wasn't the cleanup crew. I wasn't the image consultant in the wings. I wasn't the daughter who kept the family standing with duct tape and polished words. I was the one who finally walked off the stage. And they'd have to finish the show without me. The law office was in a modest brownstone in Lincoln Park, far removed from the downtown towers where my family's lawyers held court. No marble floors, no glass-etched donor walls. Just a sturdy oak door, a brass handle that clicked cleanly, and a receptionist who offered me water without glancing at my last name like it came with a caution label. It was exactly what I needed. My attorney's name was Renee Caldwell, sharp-eyed, plain-spoken, and known for taking on corporate misconduct cases without flinching. She'd come recommended by a former classmate who now specialized in nonprofit ethics. Renee didn't ask me how I felt about the foundation. She asked for documents, timelines, access. She read through the forged agreement, the donor contract, the articles of incorporation that had quietly used my name to prop up millions in risk. This will be uncomfortable, she told me on our second meeting, but not complicated. Uncomfortable was fine. I'd been raised in discomfort. But complicated was a line I wasn't willing to re-enter. By Friday, she'd filed preliminary motions to have my name formally removed from all active financial guarantees associated with the Maddox Foundation, effective retroactively to the date the forged signature was submitted. It was a calculated move. Symbolic, yes, but also surgical, because without my name, the credit line's validity weakened. And without the credit line, the expansion project became not just delayed, but dead weight. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt cleaner. Like I'd rinsed something sticky off my skin that had clung for far too long. That weekend, a call came from a name I didn't recognize, Brandon Ellis Jr. partner at one of the firms that handled my father's political affairs. His tone was crisp but forced the way someone speaks when they've been told not to condescend but don't quite know how to avoid it. "Ms. Maddox," he began, "I'm calling informally just to gauge interest in a potential resolution, something quiet outside the headlines." "Go on," I said. "We're prepared to offer a clean disassociation agreement. In exchange, you'd release any claims of misrepresentation or forgery. No public statements, no involvement in board inquiries. It would allow us all to move on. Gracefully." There it was, gracefully. The word they always used when they meant silently, obediently, with your mouth shut and your chin up. "Who authorized this?" I asked. Brandon paused. "I'm not at liberty to name clients." "So Griffin," then I said flatly. Another pause. "Look, Ms. Maddox, you're well respected. This isn't about revenge, I know that. We just want to preserve—" "No," I interrupted. "This isn't about preserving anything." He shifted in his pitch. "Then what is it about?" I let a beat pass, then said, clearly calmly, "This isn't revenge. This is clarity." Brandon was silent. "I'm not looking to destroy anyone," I continued, "but I won't protect them anymore. I won't be the silent fix for something they knowingly broke. If they want closure, they'll have to build it without my name at the bottom of the page." He thanked me, offered to follow up by email, then hung up with a rehearsed pleasantness that rang hollow. Later that afternoon, Renee called. "They're rattled," she said, "which means we're close. Close to what I asked. To you not needing to carry this anymore." I sat at my kitchen table after the call, watching the sun sink low over the lake. The light hit the surface like it had in my childhood. The same lake, same city, different woman. I thought about all the things I hadn't said over the years. All the moments I bit my tongue to keep the peace. And how peace had never been mine to begin with. Now I wasn't yelling. I wasn't making threats. I was just walking my name back out of the rooms it had been used in without my consent. I was drawing a line, not to punish them, but to finally protect myself. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care who that made uncomfortable. The lake was still half frozen when we arrived, ice lacing the edges like cracked glass. The old cabin hadn't changed much, same creaky porch boards, same faded green shutters that refused to stay latched in the wind. It was the place we'd first escaped to months ago, back when I still second-guessed everything I said out loud. Now it felt like the only place quiet enough to hear myself breathe. Noah unpacked the car while I walked the perimeter boots crunching over frosted ground. The air was sharp, pine-heavy. The sun ducked behind thin clouds as if giving us space. I stopped at the dock, hands in my pockets, and stared out across the water, watching the last patches of snow melt along the far shore. It had been a brutal few weeks. Legal filings, press follow-ups, family silence that spoke louder than any argument. But the dust was settling now, not because things were fixed, but because I'd stopped chasing resolution. I hadn't heard from Griffin since the board released a neutral statement recognizing governance discrepancies. Estelle had sent one terse email, "I hope you're happy." I didn't respond, but I was something. Not happy exactly, just unburdened. Noah came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "They'll name a storm after you if this keeps up," he murmured. I smirked. "Only if the storm has a spreadsheet and a subpoena." He chuckled, kissed my cheek, then stayed quiet. We watched the water together for a while. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it never was. It had space and weight and its own kind of language. Later inside, I lit the old stone fireplace while he reheated leftover pasta in the cabin's tiny stove. We ate on the couch, curled beneath a blanket with mismatched mugs of tea in our hands. Then, without any lead-in or performance, he turned slightly toward me. "No ring box," he said. "No big gesture, just a question." I blinked, not quite registering. He smiled gently. "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone, Sierra. Not anymore. But if you'll let me, I'd love to build a life with you your way." For a moment, I just stared at him, eyes stinging in a way that wasn't sad. There was no music swelling in the background, no dramatic sunset or applause. Just Noah. Steady, kind, real. I set my mug down and took both his hands in mine. "Yes," I said simply. Not because I needed rescuing, not because I wanted a fairy tale, because after everything, after being used, erased, performed, I wanted to build something honest, something that didn't require silence to survive. Noah leaned forward and kissed me. Slow, warm anchoring. Then he pulled the blanket higher over both of us and rested his head against mine. Outside, the lake creaked beneath its thin layer of thawing ice. The wind stirred through the trees in soft brushing sounds. No one was calling. No one was watching. And for the first time in years, my life didn't feel like a negotiation. It just felt like mine. It started as a whisper, a one-paragraph note buried inside the business section of the Tribune just beneath a piece about rising interest rates. The Maddox Foundation will suspend operations indefinitely, citing leadership transitions and financial restructuring. By noon, it was everywhere. The foundation's website went dark. Phone numbers rang out. A brief press release was issued through a third-party PR firm, but no one from the board went on record. It was clean, clinical, and almost forgettable, except for who wasn't mentioned. Griffin Maddox. Within hours, he withdrew from public life entirely. No campaign events, no farewell statement. Just absence. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. The collapse hadn't come all at once. It had frayed at the seams, slowly, painfully, until there was nothing left to stitch back together. The funding gaps, the lawsuits, the donor exodus after the fraud probe began picking up traction. Noah told me a few outlets had tried to connect the dots back to me, but without direct comment. The story stayed focused on the numbers, the board, and the glaring absence of the man who once posed smiling in front of a hospital wing that never got built. I wasn't interested in interviews. I didn't need the last word. I already had clarity. It was late afternoon when the letter came. A thick ivory envelope, hand-addressed in Estelle's sharp cursive. No return address, just my name, carefully written like she wasn't sure if it still belonged to her. Inside a single page. No embellishments, no performance. Just a quiet reckoning in ink. Sierra. I've watched it fall apart, all of it. The structure, the story, the things we convinced ourselves were worth protecting. You lived right. I was wrong. I see it now. I don't ask you to come back. I don't expect a reply. I just needed to say you were always the strong one. I'm sorry I spent so long calling that weakness. Estelle. I read it once, then again, and I cried not for what we lost, but for what was finally admitted. Not aloud, not in public, but with a pen that had once signed my name without consent, and was now at last writing a truth that cost nothing but pride. I waited a day before responding. My reply was short. Estelle, forgiveness isn't re-entry, but I wish you peace. Sierra, no return address, just my name. That night, Noah and I stood on the back porch of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky turn to ink. The lake had thawed completely now, rippling against the rocks below. He didn't ask about the letter. He didn't need to. Sometimes legacy doesn't end in fire or fury. Sometimes it just fades because the people holding it finally let go. And sometimes that's enough. The conference room was smaller than I expected. No chandeliers, no dramatic spotlights, just a circle of chairs and the soft hum of a coffee machine near the back wall. The Women's Leadership Seminar had drawn a mix of founders, artists, nonprofit directors, and one surprisingly sharp real estate investor in a denim blazer. No one asked about the Maddox Foundation. No one whispered my name like it came with scandal. I was just Sierra. The moderator, a warm-eyed woman named Tasha, introduced me with a single sentence. Today, Sierra Maddox will share how she redefined success on her own terms. There was polite applause. I stood steady but unassuming and spoke without notes. I used to think boundaries were walls. That drawing a line meant cutting people out, I said. But sometimes boundaries are the only way to stay in your own life. I told them about the silence I had learned to survive in. About the ways performance had been expected, applauded, and then weaponized. I didn't mention my family by name. I didn't need to. The room understood. I spent a long time trying to be useful instead of true. And it took watching something collapse with my name sewn into it to realize I wasn't obligated to hold it up anymore. Heads nodded. A few people took notes. One woman wiped her eyes. Autonomy doesn't always come with applause, I said toward the end. Sometimes it comes with lost distance and the quiet decision to no longer participate in a version of yourself someone else wrote. The room was still when I finished. And then applause, but not loud, warm, real. Afterward, someone asked if I would ever return to the public foundation world. No, I said, but I'm building something new, and I meant it. That evening, I met Noah at the bakery down the block from our apartment. He'd been taste testing the wedding cake options, unofficially elected the head of dessert planning, when I admitted I couldn't care less about fondant. He kissed me when I walked in a smudge of buttercream at the corner of his mouth. Red velvet wins, he declared, passing me a fork. No speeches, no stages, just cake and people who love us. That had been the plan from the start. No donors, no big announcements, just a small ceremony by the lake, 30 guests. My dress was simple. My vows were mine. Estelle wasn't invited, neither was Griffin. But that wasn't out of anger, it was just peace. A clean, open space where their stories didn't belong anymore. We sent out handwritten invitations, not printed ones. The RSVP deadline was generous. The florist was a friend of Noah's sister who insisted on covering it as a gift. We didn't have a wedding planner. We didn't need one. We chose the date ourselves, not based on donor calendars or political optics. Just a weekend in early spring when the lake glowed blue and the trees stretched pale green fingers toward a warmer sky. I kept a journal during the weeks leading up to the wedding. Nothing poetic, just little entries. Notes about how the air smelled different in the morning. A list of guests I was grateful for. One entry simply said, I can breathe. The night before the ceremony, Noah and I walked down to the dock. Same one where I'd once stood alone, unsure of what I was allowed to want. This time, I wasn't afraid of wanting anything. He squeezed my hand. Tomorrow, he said. I nodded. Tomorrow. He looked at me and smiled in that quiet way of his soft eyes' sure hands. This time, there's no script, he said. Just us. And he was right. No legacies to carry, no reputations to defend, no seats at the head table bought with someone else's silence. Just two people choosing a life. One that didn't need approval to be real. It had been nearly a year. Spring had returned to the city, soft and fragrant, blooming through cracks in sidewalks and climbing brick walls like it had something to prove. I walked alone that afternoon. No meetings, no calls to return, no performance to step into. Just me in the streets I used to hurry through, always trying to earn a place that never truly belonged to me. The Maddox Foundation building stood quiet now, its glass doors locked, the once burnished logo plaque dulled by weather. For years, I used to rush through those doors in heels that blistered and a smile that wasn't mine. I solved crises in those halls, rewrote press statements at midnight, nodded through board meetings where no one ever asked my opinion unless something needed fixing quietly. Now a for lease sign hung in the window. A curled flyer from a cleaning company had been taped to the frame and forgotten. I paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the familiar stone facade. It hadn't changed, but I had. Behind me, someone passed, glanced up, and kept walking. No one recognized me. No one whispered. And still, I smiled, because that building had once owned more of me than I realized. Not just my time, but my name, my silence, my willingness to disappear behind a polished brand. But not anymore. In the months since I'd started a small consulting group focused on ethical nonprofit advising, just me and two other women who understood what it meant to be the invisible glue holding everything together. We chose our clients. We told the truth. We kept it small on purpose. No gala launches, no press features, just real work. Noah and I spent weekends at the lake. We planted mint in ceramic pots and burned through novels in a hammock we never got around to hanging properly. Some days where heavy grief doesn't vanish just because the noise quiets. But it was honest. It was ours. Sometimes people still asked what happened to the Maddox Foundation. I always said the same thing. It ran its course. But the truth was simpler than that. They built a legacy on my name expecting it to hold. And I let them for far too long. But now standing in front of that shuttered glass door, I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't feel regret. I felt something stronger. Ownership. I turned to go, letting the wind catch the edge of my coat. I didn't look back. They used my name like currency, I whispered to no one. But it was never theirs to spend,